the best of the week on Relevant Radio.
Now, coming up this Saturday, January the 18th, it's the beginning of the annual week of prayer for Christian unity, which culminates with the Feast of the Conversion of St. Paul, celebrated in Rome at the Basilica of St. Paul outside the walls on January the 25th. The Week of Prayer for Christian Unity finds its roots back in the 19th century when Pope Leo XIII encouraged the practice of a prayer octave for unity. In fact, during this week, Catholic, Orthodox, Lutheran, Baptist, Pentecostal, and other Protestant denominations are invited to pray in a particular way for unity among Christians. This year's theme for the Week of Christian Unity is based on a text from the Gospel of John. Do you believe this? From John 11:26. I spoke to our spiritual director, Father James Kubicki, about the meaning of the octave of prayer for Christian unity. Here's my conversation with Father Kubicki. Father Kubicki, thanks so much for being with us. It is always a joy to be with you.
Well, thank you, John, and it's great to be with you and all our listeners as well, and especially as we begin this special week of prayer for Christian unity. I think it's often a week that is lost or ignored. We're really not that cognizant of it, aware of it, but I think it's so important because different popes, including Pope St. John Paul II, had talked about spiritual ecumenism. You know, ecumenism means that we are trying to work together for visible unity among all the Christians. And it begins with prayer. We know that we can't, with our own human means, achieve the kind of unity that the Lord wants. It really comes from His grace. And so we have to open ourselves up to that grace of unity. And, you know, John, I think this is so important because we live in such a divided and broken country, such a divided and broken world. And the world can look at the Christians and say, well, how can you expect us who are not believers to be one and to have peace with one another when you Christians yourselves are so divided and in some ways in conflict with one another? And so we have a very strong responsibility to pray and to work for unity among all Christians so that we can be a more visible witness of God's power and the opportunity and the possibility of there being unity and peace in our world.
Well, Father Kubicki, this is a very important week for all Christians. And, you know, I have never been to the Basilica of St. Paul outside the walls in Rome during this time. I have been there numerous times, but never, during this octave for the prayer for Christian unity. I did have the opportunity once to go to a beautiful service here in the Archdiocese of Chicago with Francis Cardinal George and many, many other Protestant leaders praying together. And I remember it was a beautiful thing. You got Methodists and Lutherans and Baptists and everybody together. And Cardinal George was sitting in the important chair that day. I just remember thinking to myself, this is kind of a foretaste of what heaven is going to be like when we all come together as one.
That's right. And that was Jesus' prayer. You know, at the Last Supper, according to John's Gospel, chapter 17, he prayed, Father, may they be one as you and I are one, so that the world may believe. The world has an obstacle to believing that Jesus is Lord, that He is for real, because the world looks at Christians and sees our divisions. The origin of this special week of prayer for Christian unity goes back to around the year 1909, and there was an Episcopalian priest by the name of Father Paul Watson, and there was an Episcopalian nun by the name of Mother Lurana White. And the two of them conceived the idea to start a particular religious order based on Franciscan spirituality, but the goal of the order would be within the Episcopal Church to work for unity among Christians, to bring about a greater peace and concord among Christians. And it didn't take long. This was around 1907 or so, but within 2 years, they decided that they needed to leave the Episcopal Church and be received into the Catholic Church. And so they did that, and together founded this group called the Franciscans of the Atonement. And the sisters group apparently has died out, but the priests continue. They're in Graymoor, New York, and they continue the work of ecumenism, of striving for unity. But the two of them together decided it would be good to have a week of prayer. And Father Paul, decided upon January 18th as the start date and January 25th as the ending date for this week. Now, why did he choose those dates? Well, back in the early 1900s, when he chose January 18th as the starting date, it was a feast day in the church known as the Feast of St. Peter's Chair at Rome. At that time, on February 22nd, the Feast of St. Peter's Chair at Antioch. He had been bishop of both places, first at Antioch and then in Rome. And in the 1960s, it was decided by Pope St. John the 23rd to combine these two feasts rather than have two feasts recognizing St. Peter's authority, to combine them into one. And so in February 22nd, we have the Feast of the Chair of St. Peter. But back when Father Paul Watson started this week of prayer, the feast of January 18th was the Feast of St. Peter's Chair at Rome. So it was a very Catholic feast. And then on the 25th of January, we have the Feast of the Conversion of St. Paul. And all Christians, recognize St. Paul, the author of the letters in the New Testament. And so I think Father Paul Watson, what he had in mind was this prayer would begin on a feast that was clearly a very Catholic feast, St. Peter's authority, the recognition of his headship of the church as the Bishop of Rome. And it would end on the Feast of the Conversion of St. Paul, where all Christians recognize St. Paul as a great missionary. So that's why we have this week during this time of January.
Father Kubicki, wasn't aware. I just realized the other day that this is a special anniversary of that historic meeting between the two lungs of the church, as Pope St. John Paul II used to refer to it, between the patriarch of the Eastern Orthodox and Pope Paul VI. That happened 60 years ago at this time, and that was a huge meeting between those two who had been excommunicating each other for 900 plus years.
That's right. In the 11th century, we had the break between the Eastern churches and the Western church in Rome. And it was a great break. There was a mutual excommunication. What led to it was misunderstandings and just a brokenness between the two churches. As a result of that, you had the beginning of the many Orthodox churches and then the Roman Catholic Church separated. And so we refer to people who are Christian but not Catholic, not in union with the Bishop of Rome, as our separated brethren. And as you mentioned, 60 years ago, John, Pope St. Paul VI and the Patriarch of Constantinople, I believe his name was Athenagoras, the two of them came together and lifted the official excommunication of the two churches, the two leaders of churches that had occurred in the 11th century. And of course, we're still divided in some ways, but at least that excommunication was lifted, and it was again a very important and symbolic gesture of the desire of the Patriarch of Constantinople, the leader of the Orthodox world, and the Pope, their desire that we be one and show a visible sign of unity to the world.
And we have so much in common with our Orthodox brothers and sisters. It's great that dialogue it continues, and I know that under Pope Francis, it is something that is also on his mind as well.
St. John Paul II, in I believe it was 1987, he wrote an encyclical about the Blessed Virgin Mary. And in there, he talked about how Mary is so honored by the Orthodox churches as well as by the Catholic churches. And so Mary can be a real let's say, force in our desire for unity. So I really recommend to our listeners, during this week of prayer for Christian unity, maybe to make the Angelus part of your prayer. If you're not already praying the Angelus at noon or sometime during the day, to pray that beautiful prayer to our Blessed Mother, where we recognize how open she was to the will of God. And we know it's God's will that Christians be one. And so we can pray through her intercession that she help us work and pray toward greater unity among Christians.
I know there's been a lot of dialogue with Catholics and Lutherans. What about evangelical Christians?
Well, that's something, at least very much in our country, that has been very important. And what we see is that we are being, as it were, brought together primarily through a commitment to protecting life, human life, protecting life in the womb. And so many evangelical Christians and Catholics share that same belief of the sanctity of human life. And that focus has been a real source for us to work together. And again, different popes like Pope St. John Paul II recognized that as the possibility for our working together, a way that brings Christians together to work for this very important and common cause of Christian unity. And so it's beautiful that during this week of prayer for Christian unity, we will have the march, the pro-life march in Washington, and many people from around the country, Catholics as well as many people who are non-Catholic Christians, especially evangelicals, will come together and pray together and witness to the sanctity of human life. So it's great that we have not only the spiritual ecumenism of praying for Christian unity, but also a visible witness of our commitment to recognizing the sanctity of human life.
And that was my conversation with Father James Kubicki, our spiritual director, about the upcoming week of prayer for Christian unity, which starts this weekend. Like what you just heard, share it with your family and friends. And thanks for listening.